In 1883, a farmer in Winona County, Minnesota, broke open a burial mound with a plow and found a skeleton measuring over 9 feet from skull to heel. The county newspaper ran the story on the front page. The bones were taken by men with credentials. No record of them exists today. That is not a legend, that is not folklore. That is a direct summary of a report published in the Winona Daily Republican, a real newspaper in a real archive on a real date. You can find the microfilm. What you cannot find are the bones. And that one case is not even close to the strangest one we are going to talk about today. Welcome back. If you are new here, you picked the right video to find us on. Today we are going to follow a trail of evidence that runs from 1820 all the way to a deliberate, coordinated erasure of an entire chapter of human history. Stay with me to the end of this video, because the final piece, the connection between these disappearing skeletons and what researchers are now calling the Tartarian erasure, is the thing that will make everything else make sense. Before we go into the discoveries, I need you to understand something about 19th century American newspapers, because if you do not, you will dismiss what I am about to show you, and you will miss the entire point. In the 1800s, especially between 1830 and 1910, local newspapers were the internet of their day. They were the only source of information for most communities. Editors were accountable to their neighbors. If a paper in Cartersville, Georgia ran a fabricated story about a giant skeleton found in a local mound, that editor would be publicly humiliated at church on Sunday. Credibility was everything. These were not tabloids, they were the historical record. Which means when the Smithsonian Institution's own annual reports, published between 1868 and 1895, repeatedly reference the discovery of abnormally large human remains in burial mounds across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, we are not talking about folklore. We are talking about documented, institutionally acknowledged physical evidence. The Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology catalogued these finds, their own people reported them, and then, at a very specific point in history, those reports stop, the language changes, the tone shifts, and the bones are never mentioned again. Hold on to that timeline. We are going to come back to it, because that specific point in history, the late 1890s, early 1900s, lines up precisely with something much bigger happening to the historical record of the entire world. Now let us go through the discoveries case by case. I am going to give you dates, publication names, and the specific details reported. This is not a list of some people say. This is documented press record. The first case, May 4, 1871. Archaeological surveyors working under federal contract documented a series of burial mounds in Wisconsin containing skeletal remains described as belonging to individuals of enormous stature. One skull was reported large enough that a normal adult man could wear it like a helmet. The account was cross-referenced in a summary sent to the newly formed Bureau of Ethnology. No physical specimens are held in any known public collection today. Let that image stay with you. A skull large enough to wear as a helmet, reported not by a local eccentric, but by a federal surveyor whose job was accuracy. The second case, the Lanesboro Argus, Lanesboro, Minnesota, 1883. A mound excavation by a local farmer revealed a near-complete skeleton with bone density described as more than twice that of a modern man. Double rows of teeth were noted by the reporting physician who attended the site. A representative from the Minnesota Historical Society took possession of the remains for transport to the state capitol. No record of their arrival exists in the society's archive. Double rows of teeth. This detail appears across multiple, entirely independent discoveries spanning 3 different states and 5 decades. The accounts do not copy each other, they do not reference each other, and yet the same anatomical anomaly keeps showing up. Skeptics will tell you this is a case of journalists exaggerating for readership, but here is the problem with that theory. Who told the journalist in Minnesota about the double teeth? And who told the journalist in Ohio? And who told the journalist in West Virginia? Because none of these papers were in contact with each other. Their circulations were local. Their sources were first-hand witnesses. The third case, the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer. Wheeling, West Virginia, July 10, 1880. A crew grading land for a railway extension struck a stone-lined burial chamber containing remains later measured by a local physician at approximately 8 feet 2 inches. The skeleton was accompanied by copper bracelets of a design not matching any known local indigenous craft tradition. A visiting academic from the Smithsonian Institution examined the site. The artifacts and the remains were transporting to Washington, D.C. They do not appear in any Smithsonian catalog accessible to the public. Copper artifacts, not matching any known craft tradition. That phrase will become very important when we talk about Tartaria. because Tartaria was, among many other things, a copperworking civilization of staggering scale. The fourth case, the Steubenville Daily Herald, Ohio, August 3, 1878. Excavation of a mound complex near the Ohio River yielded remains estimated by multiple observers at 10 feet in length. The bones were described as petrified, calcified beyond normal decomposition rate, suggesting extreme age. The mound itself was layered, indicating multiple occupation periods. A second, smaller skeleton found beneath the main burial was described as wearing ornamental armor fashioned from hammered copper. 3 witnesses signed affidavits. The remains were taken by a Smithsonian representative within the week. The affidavits are missing from the county courthouse record. Signed affidavits, missing from the courthouse. This is not a case of bones crumbling to dust in someone's barn. This is a case of active removal of both the physical evidence and the legal documentation of that evidence. I want to add one more before we move on, because this one is perhaps the most disturbing in terms of what it implies about the scale of deliberate suppression. The fifth case, the San Francisco Chronicle, April 19, 1895. Gold rush prospectors working a claim in the Sacramento Valley broke through into what was described as a subterranean chamber of clearly artificial construction. Inside were 7 skeletal remains, the largest measuring 11 feet 3 inches. The chamber walls were covered in geometric markings that local academics were unable to identify. The site was sealed by federal order within 48 hours. No subsequent academic report was ever filed. The prospectors who reported the discovery were warned, in writing, not to discuss the matter publicly. 2 of the 7 men who signed the initial report subsequently moved out of state with no forwarding address. 7 witnesses, a federal closure order, 2 men who simply disappeared from the record, and geometric markings that no one could identify, or perhaps more accurately, that no one was allowed to identify. Now, here is where we have to talk about the institution at the center of almost every single one of these disappearances. The Smithsonian Institution was established in 1846. Its Bureau of American Ethnology, founded in 1879, had a specific mandate to collect and catalog all physical evidence of pre-Columbian civilization in North America. All of it, that was the official mission. What that mandate actually functioned as, the evidence increasingly suggests, was a collection and containment operation. Here is what we know for certain. Between 1868 and 1894, the Smithsonian's own published annual reports reference the collection of over 17,000 skeletal remains from burial mounds. 17,000. When researchers began requesting access to the records associated with those remains in the 20th century, they were told the records were incomplete. When they asked specifically about remains of unusual stature, they were told no such remains had been collected. 17,000 sets of remains, collected on record. Then, officially, none of them were unusual. All of them were standard. All of them were normal. The most prolific mound excavating institution in American history had apparently never once found anything that did not conform to expected human dimensions. In 2014, a satirical news site published a fake story claiming that the Smithsonian had been court-ordered to release evidence of giant skeletons. It was clearly fiction, and every mainstream outlet correctly labeled it as satire. But here is what the mainstream coverage of that story always omitted. The reason people believed the satirical piece so readily was not gullibility. It was pattern recognition. The pattern of disappearance had been so consistent, so well documented in the original sources, that a fake story about an institution being forced to confess felt intuitively plausible. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is how evidence works on human psychology, and the pattern we need to examine now goes far deeper than the Smithsonian. If you have spent any time in the alternative history space over the last few years, you have heard the word Tartaria, and there is a good chance you have encountered it alongside some questionable content, mud flood theories, fantasy maps, speculative architecture claims. I am not here to sell you everything in that category. I am here to isolate the thread that is grounded in verifiable historical fact and follow it as far as it goes. Because here is what is verifiable. Tartaria, also written as Tartaria or Grand Tartary, was, by every measure of cartographic evidence available to us, one of the largest political and territorial designations on world maps from the 15th century through to the mid-19th century. It was not a mythological kingdom. It appeared on official maps produced by French, Dutch, British, and Russian cartographers. It was referenced in encyclopedias. It was treated as a real geopolitical entity. And then, in the span of roughly 50 years, between approximately 1850 and 1900, it vanished entirely from the world's historical vocabulary. Not just from maps, from textbooks, from academic curricula, From the institutional memory of every major Western nation simultaneously, no war was declared against it, no treaty dissolved it, no census noted its depopulation. It was simply unremembered. Now, look at the timeline of the giant skeleton discoveries and their disappearances. 1868 to 1895, the Smithsonian actively collecting and reporting on unusual remains from mound complexes. 1879, the Bureau of American Ethnology established, officially to preserve the record, which in practice appears to have meant consolidating access to it. 1890 to 1910, newspaper reports of giant discoveries continue, but institutional responses become faster, more uniform and more final. Bones taken, artifacts catalogued privately, witnesses discouraged. 1900 to 1920, the word Tartaria disappears from mainstream academic usage in Western nations. New historiography of Central Asia and the Eastern Eurasian continent is written without it. The timelines do not just overlap. They mirror each other with a precision that is either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of a coordinated historical revision happening at the exact same moment across multiple domains simultaneously. And here is the connection that most researchers in this space have missed, or have not followed all the way to its logical conclusion: the copper artifacts. Tartaria, whatever it was in its full form, is consistently associated in pre-erasure sources with advanced metallurgy. Specifically, copper and bronze working at a scale that predates the conventional timeline of these technologies in the regions involved. The Ural Mountains, the Altai Range, the Siberian Basin, regions historically within the Tartarian designation, show archaeological evidence of copper extraction and processing that is genuinely anomalous within accepted academic chronology. And the giant skeletons found in the American mounds, repeatedly associated with copper artifacts of unknown cultural origin, copper armor, copper jewelry, copper tools, in designs that do not match any catalogued indigenous craft tradition. These were the remnant physical remains of a civilization connected to, or itself constituting, what history briefly recorded as Tartaria. Then their suppression was not archaeological negligence. It was geopolitical necessity, because a giant copperworking civilization that predates the accepted founding narratives of America does not just complicate history. It demolishes the legal and philosophical foundations of manifest destiny, of land ownership, of the entire colonial project. Think about what is at stake if a prior advanced civilization, physically larger, technologically sophisticated, geographically distributed across both the Eurasian continent and the North American continent, is acknowledged as real. Who owns the land? Who descended from whom? Which origin story is true? Which institutions built their legitimacy on a history that was false? You do not need a secret cabal meeting in a basement to answer those questions. You need a shared institutional incentive. And in the 1890s, every major Western institution, academic, governmental, colonial, had exactly the same incentive to ensure those questions were never asked. I want to be precise with you here, because this is where a lot of content in this space loses credibility by overclaiming. I am not telling you that giants built the pyramids. I am not telling you that there was a worldwide empire of 12-foot humanoids who were wiped out by a flood. Those claims take you into unfalsifiable territory, and I will not take you there. What I am telling you is this: there is a documented, reproducible, primary source verifiable pattern of 19th century newspaper reports, geographically distributed, internally consistent, anatomically specific, describing skeletal remains of abnormal human stature. There is a documented pattern of those remains being collected by a specific institution. There is a documented absence of those remains from that institution's public record. And there is a documented, simultaneous erasure of a geopolitical entity, Tartaria, that would provide the most coherent explanatory framework for who might have built the infrastructure and left the copper artifacts that keep appearing alongside these remains. What would it take for this to be innocent? It would require every single newspaper editor across 20 different states to have independently decided to fabricate the same specific anatomical details, the double teeth, the above normal bone density, the copper associations, without any coordination. It would require the Smithsonian to have simply lost 17,000 sets of remains through administrative incompetence while simultaneously maintaining otherwise meticulous records. And it would require the academic erasure of Tartaria to be an organic, uncoordinated, coincidental event that happened to align exactly with the window in which physical evidence of a pre-existing advanced civilization was being removed from public access. You are allowed to decide that all of those coincidences are real. I am not here to tell you what to conclude. I am here to make sure you have seen the evidence in full, because evidence is what this channel is about. What I will say is this: the historians who should be investigating this and some quietly are face a genuine methodological problem. The primary evidence is gone, the bones are gone, the affidavits are gone. What remains are newspaper archives, partial institutional reports, and cartographic records. In mainstream academia, the absence of physical evidence is treated as evidence of absence. But that logic only holds if you also believe the disappearance of the evidence was accidental. And once you have read the Sacramento case, with its federal closure order and its 2 witnesses who vanished from the record, accidental is a very hard word to use with a straight face. Here is where I want to leave you today. Somewhere in the United States, in a facility that is not publicly catalogued, in a storage system that does not appear in public budgets, there are almost certainly physical remains that would permanently alter our understanding of human history on this continent. That is not a fantasy. That is the logical conclusion of the documentary trail we have followed together in this video. The mounds are still there, some of them, the ones that were not leveled for parking lots, shopping centers, and railway embankments in the 19th and 20th centuries. There are an estimated 100,000 earthwork mounds in the eastern United States alone. The majority have never been properly excavated with modern methods. A small but growing number of independent researchers are doing ground-penetrating radar surveys of those that remain accessible. Some of what they are finding is not fitting the approved narrative. I will be covering those surveys in an upcoming video, and when I do, we are going to need to revisit everything we talked about today, because the radar results do not just confirm the scale of what was buried, they begin to suggest the scale of what was built, and built by something that, by every physical measurement available to us, was not the same as what we are. The giants did not disappear because they never existed. They disappeared because someone needed them to. And the same hand that erased Tartaria from the world's maps reached across the Atlantic and erased the bones from the ground. If you are watching this and you have access to local newspaper archives, especially from any state along the Mississippi or Ohio valleys, from the 1860s through to the 1920s, I want to hear from you. Drop what you find in the comments. We are building a crowdsourced archive of these original reports, and every find matters. Share this video with one person who you think would never believe this is real, because the point is not to convince them. The point is to show them the primary sources. Let the evidence do the work. That is all it ever needs to do. Subscribe if you are new, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next one, because the next one is going to go further than this one did, and this one went pretty far.